I figured while I'm here, it's probably a good spot in my build to take a pause and kind of go over a few interesting things. If this is a swap that you're never done or you're thinking of undertaking, this is a Suzuki Samurai 1995, the Jimny Safari. It came with a 1.3 liter fuel injected carburetor inline 4 engine. Which is the base for like the sidekicks, the trackers, the Vitaras, and the Sunrunners, and all that stuff. I've put in a Volkswagen ALH TDI. Some challenges with it, which there have been many, is you can get an adapter plate, of course, that has to mate with a Suzuki Sidekick or other, but certainly not the Samurai. But in this case, a Sidekick transmission, so I got an adapter plate made to mate with that transmission. So the transmission is considerably larger, and so I used the scissor jack and actually spread out the tunnel in order to fit the transmission, which worked. And then, of course, there's no engine mounts. I had to more or less custom mount these. These came from Doomsday Diesel, but everything else I form fitted with wood several times over before I got them made in metal. And then I tap welded them and then got them professionally welded. So those are the engine mounts for it. Of course, with me, I have to do everything twice. So the saga continues with, I'm on my second engine already, which is so much fun. That was super unfortunate because the engine itself was in great shape, but when I replaced the timing belt and water pump, I did not replace these rollers. I didn't even know that you had to do that. And the tensioner bolt snapped and I lost tension on the timing belt, skipped a gear on the cam, which impacted a piston and a valve together, which destroyed the engine, which is really unfortunate. But hey, at least I have some spare parts that I'm peeling off. What's interesting is when you're putting the flywheel back on is the instructors are going to tell you actually to cut your flywheel, which is pretty important. So this is on the old engine. The first time I did this, you're going to leave 5/32 of an inch left for the flywheel to mount on. So that was an interesting adjustment for me, cutting the flywheel of your engine. But I figured I'd go over how a diesel engine works, because one of the major things for me is I'd never worked on a diesel before, let alone a turbo diesel. All of the work that I'd been doing was on gasoline engines. I've done a few engine swaps. I've done things from all the suspension to brake lines and whatnot, but this was new to me. And it seems simple. Diesels don't have spark plugs, and that's, of course, a very general concept, but it's quite a bit more intensive than that, if you will. So while I'm here, before I throw the timing belt on, I thought I'd show you that. On a gas engine, what you typically have is at the back of the engine, you'd have a distributor cap, or on a more modern engine, you'd actually have a computer controlled spark plug injection. So the computer tells the spark when to fire to get the perfect amount of efficiency and power. On a diesel, you don't get that. Well, not to say you don't get it, you just get it through a diesel injection pump. So this is actually run off of the timing belt, and what it does is it takes the pressure, the fuel from the fuel tank, and pressurizes it, and then forces it in, and then rotates. And what it's actually doing is it's sending the fuel not only under high pressure through these diesel injectors, but into the cylinder at a very specific moment. So as the piston's going up to reach the top of the engine, top dead center, just as it's driving back downwards, that's when the injection pump will fire the fuel into the cylinder, and that amount of pressure just auto ignites the flash point of the diesel, which gives you tons of torque, tons of power, and a fair amount of efficiency, especially when you throw a turbo into the mix. So some might say that this is a twin overhead cam, but that's not the case. It's a single overhead cam because that is the actual cam shaft. This is just a pump that's running off of the timing belt. The cam, just like a gasoline engine, rotates over and it operates the intake and exhaust valves. This is a single overhead cam, so this cam controls both the intake and exhaust all in one, which totally fine, quite reliable. Reduce the complexity. That's great for me. Everything, of course, runs off of the crankshaft here, and as you can tell, I received this engine being told that it's in top dead center, and of course that I need to confirm that before I rotate the engine over. So I'm not gonna start the motor, use the starter motor or anything like that until I've actually ran this through several times to make sure nothing's impacted, so I'm not gonna damage it. I've marked on the top of the crankshaft the indications for top dead center here, and what I did was I pulled one of the glow plugs out and just shoved a little rod down there to make sure that I was much higher than the other cylinders, which gives to me a clear indication that this one's close to or very close to top dead center, which correlates with those timing marks. So before, after, and middle, you're kind of looking for the middle mark. And then diesel injection pump, the nice thing there is, again, they indicate the hole there. They set the line up to the hole, and that gives you top dead center on cylinder 1. So the injection pump is primed to send fuel to cylinder 1. And then, of course, when you pop the valve cover off, you're going to see the valves, and they're going to be sitting flush with the engine. Neither one is going to be into the engine, and that's going to tell you that the valves are at top dead center. So you keep those three together, and you're at a very minimum not going to damage the engine, and of course get it to run with a few little bit of tweaks. How you tweak that with this engine is actually you loosen off these bolts, and you can advance or retard the injection pump to adjust when the fuel is actually sent into the cylinders, which of course is done as well electronically. So the computer is also managing that and giving you as best as it can calculate your fuel for performance and efficiency. This alternator has been rebuilt. That was probably what was the cause of the other engine not starting, and why it was sold to me is I think the alternator was toast. The battery was toast. It took 3 batteries in a running engine in parallel to get the engine to turn over in order for that one to run. Of note, what's really frustrating for me, and this I'm not kidding, was about a full year of problems, was figuring out how to do this. And if you're familiar with ALH engines, this turbo is normally oriented in the other direction. So the VNT actuator, which in other engines would be considered like a wastegate, is rotated in this way, which would impact, of all things, my steering shaft, which just never would work. There's no way in hell that would work. So my only option was to find a different turbo and clock it upwards so that the VNT would do its job. But whatever, that works. That was a long learning process. The rest of it's relatively simple at the moment. As you can see, the exhaust is just straight piped, which, it's got a turbo, so it's actually quieter than you think. Of course, at some point I'd love to, have proper exhaust. Of course, what you didn't see is as I was putting this engine in, I clipped a brake line. So I have the joys of replacing that as I go. So that's nice. The transmission, way down there. That's, out of a 2-wheel drive Suzuki Sidekick, which is pretty important because after a certain year, Sidekicks just came with 4-wheel drive transmissions. It's got a transfer case attached to it. The Samurai did not, and so I had to mate the transmission up to the transfer case, and then I had to get my drive shaft custom shortened and adjusted in order for it to fit and balanced and all those things. So that was, again, a lovely learning curve, especially when it came down to keeping the yoke, which is key. The yoke from the drive shaft has to be from a Sidekick, or you'll leak all your transmission fluid out. That, again, was a very long, frustrating learning process. But now this engine's in, I'm going to put the timing belt on, and it should be pretty much plug and play, good to go. The last thing I kind of talk about is the Samurai power steering. I haven't had power steering in this truck for many years, but I am confident that with some pressure fittings that I've had custom made, one for the input, one for the output, and then this is the power steering pump from the ALH engine originally. It's going to sit there, and that's going to feed my power steering, so I'll go back to having that, which would be nice. That's more or less how a diesel functions overall. There's been, of course, a couple of other additions. All of the tubing for my radiator, etc., that's all been painstakingly found and bent and fit in such a way that it works. Of interest, the Volkswagen family of diesels, they come with a radiator that doesn't have a radiator cap. It doesn't really matter for or against. This is the format of their version of a radiator cap. It takes the steam from the top of the engine and brings it back to the steam port, which then condenses and becomes coolant the same way your radiator would, and then it sends the fluid back into the engine to cool your engine. Everything else that you're more likely familiar with is a radiator that has a cap here, and the cap does the function of that job. Almost identical, probably is identical in function, just if you call it style. Some people like the reliability of this system. That's just what I had to work with. Not much else to really say, aside from if you're looking for brake boost, right? Diesel, how do you don't have negative pressure in your intake really, and you need a brake booster. That comes from a vacuum pump off the back of the engine, which again, I didn't really know that was a thing until now. So that's where vacuum comes. It gives you mechanical advantage in your brake booster, which also supplies you with these other hoses, because of course the VNT actuator is just a valve that opens and closes and regulates your turbo pressure, which is somewhat unique. It's not a wastegate that releases pressure when it builds up. It's more of a wastegate that opens up the vanes. That's why it's a VNT actuator that opens and closes vanes, which makes the turbo pressure either useful to you or useful to just sending it out the exhaust to avoid pressure buildup in your engine and blowing your engine. So that's how that works. That was another long, arduous process for me to figure out. This is an intercooler out of a Passat, actually, which another fun frustration was that the intercooler that came with the engine it's from a 99 Jetta, exactly the same size and style, just the input and output mounts were different, and so I needed something that was straight piped, so I had to go and buy a different intercooler, and that's how I got to that. This is a vent cap that would typically send crankcase pressure kind of exhaust gases, which would normally get sucked through your intake and through your EGR and all that stuff. I've got a filter now, so that pressurized gases and smoke is going to go through this and filtered. And I'd highly recommend that. I think that's the right move to make. It wasn't an expensive ordeal. And all of that is for this truck, which is pretty unique. It's a Samurai right-hand drive from Japan. I guess there's not too many like it. I've given it kind of a goofy paint job. At some point I'll detail what I've done to the interior, because I've put different seats, etc. in there. It's got ARB air lockers front and rear, and the transfer case is re-geared for insane amounts of torque. You can basically put the truck in gear, not even worry about the clutch, and step out of the truck and walk beside it, and then you could butt it up against a tree and the engine doesn't even notice that the tree's there. It'll just spin the tires, which is pretty cool. The rest is kind of there. I think in dealing with the harness came from Fast Forward Auto. out of Cornell. And what I had to do there is the original Samurai electrical harness came out of these two ports, and then I had to physically separate them from engine components to accessories like lights and wipers and washers and all that shit, and completely separate it so that I knew what I needed and what I didn't in order to make it work. So that's it. That's where I'm at. Hopefully I'll have this thing turning over in the next 24 hours. So wish me luck. Hopefully I don't blow this one up. So now I just figured while I'm here, when I first turned it over, I had a bit of an impact, and I again thought that was, that I had gotten it wrong, which didn't seem right. I was certain that I had it timed correctly. So I took the glow plugs out, and again, why don't I get you back into top dead center? There. So shove the wire in there into the glow plug hole, and stops shallow. Okay, so top dead center there, which would tell me that I should be on the compression stroke, I think, of cylinder 4. Why? I don't know why my brain can't do that. I just know that 1 and 4 need to be the same, and 3 and 2 need to be dissimilar. So these guys, this correlates well. That's going to be, I think, an intake stroke, because there's intake or exhaust. I think that's the intake. Intake valve is depressed, like so. That one's extended, so it's intaking air at the time. And then this one's doing the opposite, so again, it should also be low, which makes sense. However, now that I've turned it over, all that I was getting was, it looks like the engine just hadn't been turned in a little while, and the valves got a little stuck. Hence, that really does indicate the need for assembly lube. I'll definitely be putting that in here when I put this together. So anyways, assembly lube into the engine, and oil just kind of keeps those valves moving, which is another clear indication that spending the time to get it right is important. And so I'm rotating the engine over. And one of the other things, little tips that I would add to this is, as you're adding your timing marks, these white marks, don't bother adding any of the marks to the actual belt itself, because it'll never correlate, or it might take like 1,000 revolutions before the lines light up again. So don't worry about lines on the belt. Worry about that mark meeting that one, this mark meeting that one, and that mark meeting that one. That's all that matters. You can do the same thing with the harmonic balancer or the belt pulley there. A lot of things you can actually open up an inspection port on the transmission and do the same. There'll be one that'll correlate with top dead center there. They do give you a ton of opportunities to get this right. For one example is the flywheel, the harmonic balancer. This literally does only go on one way. What they do is 2 of these bolts, you can just kind of see it. 2 of these bolts are slightly closer together than the other ones, which means there's only one way that this can go on. So this will also help indicate top dead center. Funny enough, this came from the other engine, and that's the mark that I had on that engine, which will correlate with that mark on the top dead center of the crankshaft. So it sounds complicated, but really it isn't. You kind of can't get it wrong. And when it comes down to it, like when all is said and done, when you put it all together and turn the engine over, so long as you're not getting impacts, like you're obviously not shoving a valve into a cylinder, you won't get it wrong. It might not fire. Your diesel injection pump might not be set up right. You might hydrolock the engine. That's certainly a thing where you could fill a cylinder with fluid and then it compresses that. Like, that's not good. But in terms of actual mechanical intrusion into the engine, if you do it this way, you can't get it wrong. I will note, one thing that just fucking infuriates me is You see the smiley face there? So the dot lines up with the notch. This is the tensioner. It anchors itself there on this chunk of plastic, which is supposed to have this in there, which makes sense. I want that in there. Every time that I go to tension this, the anchor pops out and I'm left with that chunk of plastic to work with. At such a critical moment in an engine build, why the fuck they wouldn't give you something more significant to anchor your tensioner off of is beyond me. And so much so that I'm gonna undo this and pop this thing back in there and do it again and try to get it right, because why would they give you a piece of plastic? I'd never rely on that. And this sitting in plastic is no better. That just blows my mind. Anyways, we're there. The engine is together. It's, to my knowledge, in time. I have to put the vacuum pump back on. Of course, most of you probably know one of the ways of keeping the camshaft in line is with a tool that holds that into top dead center. For sure, use that. I agree. There's a pin you can shove into there that holds the diesel injection pump in time. I get it. Like that, all of those things make sense because it is a Swiss watch. So that's the correct way of doing it. I'm just showing you like how to find top dead center if that was rotated in some random orientation in comparison to the others and you needed to find it. This is how I do it. I'll turn this engine over and it'll probably take a little bit of tweaking with the diesel injection pump, but it'll run. That's how I did it the last time. That's how I'll do it this time. I'll for sure do this once or twice over to get it done correctly with this thing in the right spot. But either way, that's how I do it.